Before reading Punisher Max Bourne, I thought I understood Frank Castle. Like most people, I assumed the Punisher was born the day his family was murdered. But after finishing the story, I'm not so sure. Because Bourne asks a much darker question. What if Frank Castle was already the Punisher long before that day? This isn't a superhero story. It's a war story. A brutal look at a man who seems more comfortable in combat than anywhere else in the world. While everyone around him dreams of surviving Vietnam and going home, Frank Castle is one of the few men who seems afraid of something else entirely. He's afraid the war might end. And the deeper this story goes, the more you begin to realize that the most dangerous thing in Vietnam isn't the enemy. It's what's happening inside Frank Castle. So today, we're diving into one of the darkest Punisher stories ever written, the story that many fans believe is the true birth of the Punisher. And it all begins in the final days of the Vietnam War. It was at Firebase Valley Forge, a small military base located 7 miles from the Cambodian border. The place became a military base belonging to the United States Army during the Vietnam War in late October 1971. When 6 soldiers were seen relaxing, waiting for an airplane to land. Nothing happened at first, until suddenly, the plane was shot by the enemy and destroyed. The soldiers looked very surprised by the sudden attack. The plane immediately fell towards the soldiers, making them run for their lives, but unfortunately, the plane still fell and hit several military personnel. Meanwhile, troops from other squads saw this from a distance and did nothing. They watched the incident as if they knew it would happen. None of them wanted to go down there to help their comrades in arms. There were even soldiers who gambled that it would happen. But unlike one young man who had the principle, "I will not die in Vietnam." His name is Stevie Goldwyn, and he is a soldier with a short body. He has 39 days left, which means he is a new soldier there. Even so, Stevie didn't feel at home and vowed that he would leave the place for good and live freely. He dreamed that one day he would go home on a beautiful airplane and fall asleep in it. He would smile and beautiful angels in flight attendant outfits would greet him and bring him a cold beer. He promised with all his heart that he would not die and would leave the killing fields. He would not re-enlist and serve a second tour of duty, nor did he want to become battle addicted like most soldiers. And to be sure, Stevie said in his heart, "I will not fall in love with war like Captain Castle." Looking back after finishing this series, this line feels incredibly important. Stevie sees war as something to survive. Frank sees it as the only place where he truly belongs. Stevie began to tell the story of his favorite captain, none other than Frank Castle, who would later be known as the Punisher. According to him, he was the best officer he had ever known in the Marines of Firebase Valley Forge. He was also the reason why Stevie was confident that he would survive the place. He was dedicated to his men, but not out of emotional feelings like love, but out of a sense of professional responsibility to do his job right. Since his arrival 6 months ago, not a single soldier has been tortured and died in the line of duty. That's what makes Frank so fascinating in Bourne. He's not a bad leader. In fact, he's probably the most competent man in the entire base. The scary part is what drives that competence. Stevie also recounted Frank Castle's early military career, which began during the Tet Offensive in 1968. The higher-ups in Da Nang saw great potential in him, despite his darker side. They recruited him into the Special Forces. Frank's second tour of duty was a mystery, but there were rumors that he was involved in covert operations in Cambodia, Black Ops, and even the assassination of a North Vietnamese army general near Hanoi. It was a horror story too bizarre to be true. But now the war in Vietnam is winding down, and no one knows what to do about the predators that have proliferated there. Frank's third assignment was to send him to Valley Forge, because they had to send him somewhere. He was a special assassin leading an infantry. In this war, the enemy wrote clearly, "America will soon be gone from here." It's a shame for Frank, because the war he's facing is coming to an end. Most soldiers spend their days dreaming about going home. Frank is one of the few people in this story who seems disturbed by the idea that the war might actually end. When they were exploring the forest, Frank suddenly ordered his troops to stop. He seemed to feel the arrival of the enemy, so he had to stop the movement of his soldiers. They were also getting ready to lurk at various points to immediately attack if an enemy passed by. And sure enough, Frank's guess was 100% correct, because there were enemies walking through the forest, carrying goods using buffaloes. Without further ado, they immediately opened fire without mercy on the Viet Cong to destroy them all. The more I read this story, the more it feels like Frank isn't simply good at war. He understands it on an instinctive level that makes everyone around him look ordinary. The Viet Cong soldiers also tried to counterattack, but to no avail, because they could not predict the attack. Frank and all his men could freely shoot them, because they had hidden in positions that could not be guessed. There were even Viet Cong soldiers who hid behind trees to avoid their attacks. Unfortunately for him, one of Frank's soldiers shot the tree with a machine gun, piercing the sides of the tree and killing the Viet Cong soldier. They tried to run from there, but Frank had installed a claymore mine with a trigger connected to a rope. The bomb finally thwarted the escape of the Viet Cong soldiers. And when there was one person left, Frank's soldiers did not shoot him immediately, but threw a grenade at the Viet Cong soldier to blow him up. They all laughed at this, but not Stevie. He wanted to have many sons. When the war was over and he returned home, he would sleep with many beautiful women, but there was only one beautiful woman he would marry. That woman would carry his sons, and they would grow tall and strong like giants, and he would watch them grow up and sing with pride. Stevie will also take them into the jungle and up the mountains to show them the best country in the whole world, the Promised Land, which is their homeland. The good America, the real America. Stevie is important because he reacts the way a normal person should. He reminds us how disturbing this violence really is, even when the other soldiers barely notice it anymore. Stevie then took the severed head of a Viet Cong soldier and promised that he would not make such a tragic mistake into darkness. In years to come, his children would find out that their father went to war and they would be proud of it. They would start asking what their old man did and who he fought and where he went and what he saw there. But Stevie would never tell them. After wandering through the deep, dark jungle, Frank finally went to the Colonel Ottman to give his report. Frank said that they killed 21 Viet Cong and none of them died on his side. He also reported that they got over 100 AKs, 6 RPGs, 4 mortars, which were all Chinese 53s, and not small arms. They also got enough ammunition and grenades to supply the company for a week. They had bombed half a dozen rifles and destroyed the rest. So Colonel Ottman asked Frank when the NVA would run out of supplies. Notice how emotionally detached Frank is here? He isn't celebrating, he isn't horrified, he's simply evaluating results. So Colonel Ottman asked Frank when the NVA would run out of supplies. Frank then explained that this was the 3rd supply delivery they had made in 2 weeks. They couldn't guess how much supply had made it in, with uneven patrols. Frank also said that the VC had brought in NVA equipment, which meant one thing: an attack. They were stockpiling supplies for the attack, and when they came, it would go straight through Frank's troops. Frank insists that they're on their own, so they need to be prepared. Colonel Ottman tells Frank that General Patton is coming for an impromptu inspection in an hour, and he wants Frank to greet him. Frank didn't seem to have a problem with that, and Colonel Ottman also explained that he was sick when he arrived, namely malaria. He didn't want his illness to get worse. Frank then asked if Ottman would give his report to Da Nang. Ottman said that he would do the same. Frank then left without saying anything, while Ottman informed Frank that Patton would be there in an hour, so he told him to get ready and clean up the place. Frank didn't look at the colonel and instead said, "Don't be so fucking stupid." He then walked out of the room and passed by his soldiers who were relaxing. This was the moment I started realizing how much the war means to Frank. He doesn't react like a man who's about to be sent home. He reacts like a man who's about to lose something he loves. Frank walked away with annoyance written all over his face, while Stevie kept an eye on his captain because he knew what that look meant. Not long after, General Patton arrived by helicopter. He already knew that Colonel Ottman was sick. He then explained at length what his complaints were about the place. Patton said that he had seen bunkers that were uninhabited and in desperate need of repair. He also saw artillery covered in dirt and rust and found obvious marijuana cigarette abuse. He also received reports describing the place as the heroin capital of the First Corps. General Patton also criticized the attitude of the Marines, who refused to salute a senior officer. He then asked Frank why no improvements were made to rectify the situation. He added that this was why Firebase Valley Forge had become so chaotic. Frank explained that the last person who tried to restore order in the area was Captain Garand, but he woke up the next morning next to a claymore mine. Patton insisted that the beating of the officer was a myth, explaining that it was nonsense used by peace lovers to tarnish the reputation of the war. Patton asks Frank seriously what exactly they did to restore order in the area. Frank casually replied, "Nothing." But he also explained that Valley Forge was 50% short of personnel. Most of the replacements they had received were rejects and failures, especially the NCOs. Frank added that maintaining discipline without the direction of a good sergeant was impossible. They were also short of equipment and ammunition, and resupply was a bad joke for them. The Marines on the spot knew this. They figured if the generals in the back didn't care, then why should they? Frank said that he had managed to gather about a platoon of men who were motivated to maintain their offensive patrol. If they couldn't do it, then there was no point in them being there in the first place. Patton was glad to hear that Frank also felt the same way as him, because as soon as he made the report, Patton himself felt very doubtful about the place. Frank then asked him if he was going to close the place down. Patton replied that the reason he was doing this surprise inspection was to get the answer to that question, which meant, yes, they would close the post. In my opinion, this is one of the most important conversations in the entire series. For Frank, the end of the war feels more threatening than the war itself. Frank explains that they are the only US post watching Cambodia, as the others have been sent home. He then asks Patton who will guard the enemy, block the supply lines, and who will stop the enemy from attacking. Patton explained that this was not a popular war. The communist bastards in the media had seen it, and they had to stop it immediately. Moreover, Patton also argued that what was going on around there would soon become unimportant. The conflict and their involvement in it was over. Frank then asked Patton if he had told Charlie. Patton replied that Charlie would not be his business anymore. He would send Frank and his troops home, and he also threatened Frank by expelling him from the Marine Corps. While leaving the place, Patton also said that after that, Frank could only see his enemies through television. Hearing this, Frank was very unhappy. But Frank had other plans for his general. He would show Patton something that proved that the Valley Forge post must remain open. Patton actually felt very upset, but because Frank persuaded him, he finally agreed to come with him. Frank took General Patton to a quiet place. He then told the general to go up the stairs to see something. Initially, Patton did not feel any suspicion and just followed Frank's direction. He said that he had to go higher to see the thing. Patton then climbed the stairs even though he didn't want to. After reaching the top, Patton then babbled again to Frank because he didn't see anything there. But suddenly, a bullet slid into the general's head and killed him on the spot. The first time I read this scene, I immediately felt suspicious. Garth Ennis never gives us a clear answer, and that uncertainty makes the moment even more unsettling. Finally, they brought General Patton's body home using the helicopter he used to come there, and Frank's soldiers were seen carrying the general's body to the helicopter. After lifting Patton's corpse, Stevie's gaze suddenly went in another direction. He was looking at his role model, Frank, who was alone. It made Stevie wonder what the captain was thinking. His friend told him that Frank was always up there sitting thinking. Tomorrow is another day, but not for some motherfucker. His friend then laughed as he left Stevie still staring at Frank alone. Frank himself was looking up at the night sky while struggling with his own thoughts. Very clever, Frank. You got your war a stay of execution. He convinced himself that the general's words were true too, in that the war did not last forever. He also knew that he loved war. Frank could tell his story about stopping Charlie from sneaking in and killing half of the First Corps in his sleep. This is where Bourne stops being just a war comic and starts becoming a psychological horror story. His dark side asks him, when was the last time he felt alive, so full of fierce black joy? The dark side promises Frank that he can help Frank to keep doing what he's doing right now, but there's a price to pay. But Frank can keep doing it without stopping. Frank's gaze then becomes more serious at this. The dark side said that Frank only needed to say one word and he would fix it for Frank. The dark side then asked, "Who am I? Is that what you're asking? Well, who do you think I am, Frank?" Frank just sat there in the corner in silence. This might be the creepiest scene in the entire issue. The story refuses to explain what this voice is, which somehow makes it far more disturbing. The second day at Valley Forge, Stevie meets his friend Angel in a bunker, while Angel is seen heating up drugs using his lighter. Stevie rushes to stop Angel, who has already consumed the drug. He invites Angel to leave there because Captain Castle will take the platoon out. Despite being lazy, Angel, who was too drunk to go with them, he felt very dazzled when he went out to see the rising sunlight. But their steps had to stop when someone called Stevie's name. A big man and his friend came to stop them because Angel hadn't paid for the drugs he used. Stevie took out his money and told the man named Coltrane that they already had an agreement not to allow Angel into his bunker. But Coltrane didn't care about that and instead told his friend Garcia to hold them back. But suddenly Coltrane changed his mind and told Garcia to leave them alone. They finally left, leaving Stevie and Angel behind. Apparently, Captain Castle was standing behind them waiting for the two soldiers. Frank asked Stevie whether Angel was clean from drugs or not. Stevie lied and replied, "He is, sir." Frank left, saying, "Make sure he stays that way." Stevie was relieved that his captain didn't see through his lie, and he said inwardly that he would rather face Coltrane with his razor than look the captain in the face. Frank was a strict man. He wouldn't let an addict into his team because he couldn't shoot properly. But unlike Angel, Stevie had faith in his friend's abilities. Finally, the platoon was on the move that very morning through the jungles of Vietnam for the umpteenth time. In his heart, Stevie explained that Frank himself didn't group them into Platoon 1 or 3, but just called them Platoon, because they were the last 29 soldiers in Firebase Valley Forge who cared enough about the enemy to look for them. Hundreds of other soldiers might prefer to attack when the enemy came, or maybe run and hide, or even they would overdose before the bayonet stabbed in. But not with them, who constantly hunted down the Viet Cong, and everyone had their own reasons. For example, Tedros likes to pelt the Viet Cong with grenades. McDonald has a bag of human scalps. Frank is in love with war, and Stevie himself is there for Angel. Honestly, Garth Ennis isn't being subtle here. Long before Frank becomes the Punisher, the story keeps reminding us that war means something very different to him than it does to everyone else. Stevie also told me that Angel was the one who killed 3 Viet Cong soldiers when he changed the magazine, which made him feel indebted to Angel. Stevie could have gone on for the next 38 days doing nothing like a slacker because no one cared, but Stevie stayed with his platoon. They walked through the jungle for hours with Stevie telling stories in his heart. Frank was convinced that the Viet Cong were preparing for an attack by the NVA. If they ran into Charlie or his North Vietnamese army comrades, maybe strength in numbers would prevail. You know, that's one of the biggest differences between Stevie and Frank. Stevie still believes this is a war that can be survived, while Frank already acts like survival is secondary to the mission itself. But suddenly, a bullet came at Angel and wounded his neck. The soldiers immediately panicked to save themselves and look for the sniper's whereabouts, while Tedro tried to save Angel and call for medical help. Meanwhile, Frank himself ordered his other soldiers to return fire, but this time, Frank and his soldiers seemed unprepared to respond to attacks from Viet Cong. Even Stevie's partner had to lose his eye to enemy fire. He immediately ducked to protect his head, but suddenly he heard someone asking for his M60, and that person was the one and only Frank Castle. While all his soldiers were desperate and didn't know what to do, Frank stood tall in front of them, facing his enemies without mercy, making his soldiers gape at this scene. Frank counterattacked, and the other soldiers followed suit. Now the situation was reversed, where the Viet Cong had to recognize the strength of Frank Castle. He killed all the guerrillas mercilessly, leaving his soldiers speechless, especially Stevie. You know, this is one of the first moments where Frank starts to feel larger than life. To the men around him, he almost seems more dangerous than the enemy. This war has bred a saying, oft repeated: payback is a motherfucker. At Valley Forge, we have another: if you think payback's bad, you haven't met Frank Castle, says Stevie, describing the captain's toughness. Frank managed to eliminate the Viet Cong guerrillas who were hiding and saved most of his troops. After suppressing the Viet Cong attack, their medic checked on the other soldiers and found that 6 of them were dead on the spot. And after that, he was able to treat the captain's wounds. Meanwhile, the other soldiers spread out to check who else was killed. I love this line because it perfectly captures how the platoon sees him. Frank isn't just their captain anymore. He's becoming a legend. As they were checking, one of Frank's soldiers found a Viet Cong who tried to kill herself. He kicked the Viet Cong, who was a woman. The other soldiers also came together to see the capture of a soldier named McDonald. The Viet Cong was already badly wounded, with her shirt open in front of all the men, and one of them asked what they would do to the woman. McDonald came forward and prepared to open his pants. He was going to vent his anger after the quick attack that had upset him. Meanwhile, Stevie did nothing and just watched them rape the woman. This made Stevie remember his past when a boy bullied another boy and he couldn't do anything. But this time was different. Someone came up to the group of soldiers and no one dared to stop him. While McDonald, who was having fun with the woman, said, "Wait your fucking turn." I'm not gonna lie, this is one of the most uncomfortable scenes in the series, but it's important. Ennis wants us to see just how much the war has corrupted the men around Frank. Little did he know that it was his own captain, Captain Castle. Frank came in and shot the Viet Cong in the head until her blood and brain matter splattered all over McDonald's face. "No rape, we're here to kill enemies," Frank said as he walked away. The silence in the forest was shrouded in fear for the soldiers, especially Stevie, who had a weak heart. Stevie immediately went away to the riverbank to calm down. He hoped that the bird of freedom would come and take him away right away. And that's what makes this moment so disturbing. Frank isn't defending her because he values her life. In his mind, rape crosses a line that killing does not. Stevie felt more and more depressed and wanted to go home because he was fed up with all this. But Stevie's fear did not stop there. He saw McDonald coming to the river to wash his face from the woman's blood and brain fragments. Suddenly, someone came from behind and stomped McDonald's head into the water. It was Captain Castle, who seemed to be upset at his soldiers' depraved behavior. Stevie couldn't help or say anything. He just watched wide-eyed as his captain killed his own soldier. Frank pressed the soldier's head until he ran out of breath and died. Honestly, the first time I read this scene, I realized Frank's moral code is unlike anyone else's. It's brutal, ruthless, and terrifyingly consistent. Afterwards, he walked away guiltlessly, leaving McDonald's corpse on the riverbank. Stevie was a living witness to McDonald's death at the hands of Captain Castle, and he had to keep it a secret for the rest of his life. After a grueling patrol, the soldiers finally returned to their posts, and there were several helicopters that would transport the fallen soldiers. They had searched and waited for McDonald, but never found him. Meanwhile, Frank held off the helicopters for as long as possible. You can really feel Stevie's perspective starting to change here. From this point on, Stevie stops seeing Frank as a heroic officer and starts seeing him as something much harder to understand. Stevie still looks silent, not saying anything to anyone, while Angel tries to calm him down by saying that he should forget about the tragedy of the Vietnamese woman. He emphasized that there was no tolerance for wrongdoing in that place. After hearing Angel's advice, Stevie went off to be alone and gulped down many cans of beer to relieve his stress. But Stevie was suddenly startled by Frank's voice coming up to him and asking what had kept him quiet all that time. Nervously, Stevie asks his captain if he saw him earlier, and it turns out that Frank saw Stevie when he left after killing MacDonald. Stevie admits that he was scared and asks Frank what made him do that. With a sharp look, Frank replied that he wanted to punish him. Stevie then asked again, what about the fate of the girl? And Frank replied that if he took the sniper to the medevac, then no one in the platoon would ever trust him again. So he had another excuse where he handed her over to Intel, but she didn't tell him anything. Arvin's translators then took turns interrogating her and shot her in the head. After telling Stevie why he did what he did, Frank left. But he turned around and said, "Goodwin, you don't have to be scared of me." Hearing this did not calm Stevie down at all. He was still afraid of the captain's attitude. Stevie felt that this place was hell, and they needed someone like Frank to guide them through it. Everything Frank said was also unthinkable to them, and his stern eyes scared him even more. And worst of all, what Frank did that day was his own way of helping her get out of trouble. This might be the creepiest line in the entire issue. Frank genuinely believes he's done the right thing, which somehow makes him even more frightening. On the third day, America seemed to be increasingly aggressively launching attacks on Vietnam. They have a firm principle not to lose the Vietnam War, even though the generals owned by the American Army are so stupid with very pathetic tactics. Even they are already on the brink of defeat. America continued to bombard every area in Vietnam, killing many innocent people. The morale of the American soldiers had been trampled in the deepest trenches and covered with heroin and bitter failure. They had misjudged the NVA, who turned out to be the toughest and bravest soldiers in the world, a country filled with people with short bodies but hearts like tigers. Even the world condemned America for doing something that tainted their souls forever. Even though America had carried out various attacks that ruthlessly ravaged Vietnam, they would not give up, because if they just gave up, then the world would look down on America. No one in Southeast Asia or anywhere on Earth will look at what is left of Vietnam and think it's smart to fuck with the United States. Why can't we stay out of the rest of the world? That was the question that had been puzzling Stevie. He asked why they couldn't just leave and stop messing around in the world. I really like this question because Stevie is asking something most war stories never stop to consider. He's not thinking about winning anymore. He's wondering why any of this is happening in the first place. Angel, who was relaxing at the time, was also confused by Stevie's question. Stevie explains that they have everything they could possibly want, but he still wonders why they can't just get away from the chaos of this world. Stevie tried to explain further, but Angel's attention was drawn to the two fighter planes flying in tandem in front of him. Angel is stunned to see the planes and dreams of one day riding one of the Ironbirds, while Stevie looks a little annoyed that his questions have been ignored by Angel. Meanwhile, at the same time, Frank and Colonel Ottman are seen walking together. They walk while chatting about their next war strategy. Frank says that the enemy will survive in bad weather and take advantage of it to attack. He predicts that there will be a big storm there. They will not have air support if the enemy suddenly attacks. But Ottman responded casually by saying that they still had artillery. Frank emphasized that they were far from anyone's reach, and they hadn't gotten any ammunition supplies either. Ottman didn't seem to care about it because no one cared about the place except the enemy. He also emphasized to Frank, "Everyone knows the war is almost over. And honestly, notice how differently Frank reacts to this compared to everyone else. For most people at Valley Forge, it's good news. For Frank, it almost feels like a warning. That is why Ottman also seemed not to care about what happened there, and he only wanted one thing, which was to go home. Therefore, he ordered his troops to remain silent and sit back and wait for the call home from the motherland. Frank's face instantly turned sour when he heard the colonel's words. He told Ottman that this was no time to mess around. Bad weather can be the perfect battlefield for the enemy to attack, and Frank has been paying attention to what activity might occur lately. Ottman tried to correct Frank's insolence by telling him to call him Colonel Ottman. He then sent Frank away gently, but Frank still had questions. Frank asked about the state of the headquarters led by the colonel, and asked about his responsibility as a colonel who was responsible for the lives of his soldiers. But Ottman didn't seem to care about all these things and left Frank silent there. He went to defecate. Apparently, Frank secretly followed the colonel because he had other plans. Sure enough, Frank came to the colonel who was defecating while carrying a grenade in his hand. He intended to blow up Ottman there, but suddenly Frank changed his mind. He immediately stopped his fingers before removing the grenade pin and leaving there with a sense of anger. The voice of Frank's dark side began to be heard and asked why Frank delayed his intention. The voice seemed to be trying to make Frank rethink his plan so that he immediately turned around to kill the colonel. You know, this scene is disturbing because Frank doesn't hesitate due to morality. He stops himself at the last second, but the fact that he seriously considers it tells us how far he's already drifting from normal thinking. No one will know about it, and if it happens, Frank will become the leader at Valley Forge. Frank's dark side knows his desire and tries to realize Frank's dream of leading and protecting his troops. He also convinces Frank to get rid of anyone, including Ottman, who tries to ruin his plans. He knew that Frank really wanted to kill the colonel, considering that Frank had already killed the general and one of his soldiers, and he also almost killed Ottman. Frank's dark side convinced him that they all deserved to die. Therefore, Frank should not have any doubts about his actions. His dark side assures Frank that he can do it, and he will continue to tell Frank that he can make it right for him if he says one word. In return, the dark side promised Frank that he could kill them all. Frank didn't answer anything and just stayed silent with a sharp gaze. Honestly, by this point, the voice is no longer just a passing thought. It feels like a constant presence, pushing Frank toward choices he secretly wants to make. After having a great dilemma in his heart, Frank went to Stevie, who was keeping the ammunition warm. Stevie said that he didn't want the ammunition to freeze at the wrong time. Not many people would do this, but Stevie did it anyway. This seemed to increase Frank's trust in his soldier, and he started asking Stevie if he knew Frank had a family. Stevie was a little surprised to hear the captain's words. He didn't expect the coldest and deadliest of them all to talk about such tender things. And honestly, every time Frank talks about his family in this story, it feels strangely tragic. We already know what happens to them years later, which gives these quiet moments a lot more weight.
Stevie replied that he didn't know because no one knew about him. Frank began to explain that he had one daughter who was 4 years old and another who was just about to be born because his wife had found out she was pregnant while Frank was on his third mission. He hoped that it would be a boy. Stevie says that's a good thing because it will keep Frank alive, and Frank also thinks that they are his last hope, the family he loves. You know, this may be one of the most important lines in the entire series. Frank wants to believe his family is the thing keeping him grounded, but the story keeps asking whether that's still true. Frank then tells Stevie to load up on ammunition in case of a surprise attack. He also notices Stevie's friend Angel going to Coltrane's bunker. Stevie is surprised to learn about this and rushes there. Frank offered to help, but this time, Stevie refused and would deal with it himself. He then took his M16 and went to Coltrane's bunker. The sound of Frank's dark side started to come back to Frank's ears. He asked what the mysterious Frank was doing with the softest boy in the platoon. The
The normally cold Frank is now talking about something happy and trying to pretend to be an ordinary person, and that might delay Frank from becoming what he really wants to be. His dark side asserts, "I'm your last chance, Frank, to be what you want to be." This is one of the creepiest lines in Bourne. The voice isn't tempting Frank with power or money. It's offering him permission to become the person he already is deep down. Stevie, who had come to Coltrane's bunker, hits him without preamble, immediately picks up Angel, who is almost stoned, and carries him away from there. He also brandishes his gun at Garcia, who wants to stop him. He took Angel to walk in the pouring rain, even though Angel refused. It was already dawn. He took his friend into the shade and had a heart-to-heart talk with him. Stevie tells Angel to stop using the drugs, but Angel refuses. Stevie starts lecturing Angel for going to war and coming home a junkie. Angel then swore at Stevie and said that he didn't know anything about him. According to him, Stevie probably had a lot of life after this war, like college, work, and a woman who was willing to wait for him. But not Angel, who says, "All I got waiting for me is a ghetto full of death." Stevie says they shouldn't be there, and neither should Angel. According to Stevie, the Americans shouldn't be there and involved in the war. They've caused a lot of chaos over the last 5 years and messed up their own country. But Stevie thinks that's not the real America. Angel's perspective is important because it challenges Stevie's idealized view of America. For Angel, the war isn't an interruption to life. It's just another version of the world he came from. Angel argues against that and thinks Stevie is full of shit with his idealistic attitude. Angel thinks that it's all just a dream that has been lost long ago. According to him, the real America is those who shoot each other, rape Indians, and are racist to people like Angel. Stevie disagrees with Angel, but that's the truth. Angel tells Stevie to stop lecturing him about how good things come with bad things. The truth, according to Angel, is that good things come for Stevie and bad things come for him. Stevie tries to change his friend's perspective, but Angel refuses. Suddenly, they heard someone shouting, "Sappers in the wire!" They both rushed out and saw that they had been attacked, while their comrades in arms also returned fire. One of the soldiers said that they could handle the attackers, but Frank seemed to doubt that. He ordered his soldiers to fire illumination, and finally, they found hundreds of NVA soldiers flocking to Valley Forge. They were very surprised, including Frank. But one thing you should know, this is what Frank has been waiting for all this time. There was no fear whatsoever in Frank Castle. He then asked his soldiers for the M60 and prepared to finish them all. This is the moment where the series stops being subtle about Frank. While everyone else sees a nightmare unfolding, Frank finally sees exactly what he's been waiting for. The war intensified on the fourth and final day of the battle at Valley Forge. The roar of weapons and screams sounded like a symphony of death that shook the sky. The NVA troops attacked Frank and his platoon as the sky poured down rain. Frank's soldiers are overwhelmed by the ferocity of the NVA troops, which is likened to the existence of a beast in the world. The beast has risen from the darkness and circumnavigated the globe by invading Europe, crossing the Pacific, and destroying the evil that resides there. Once it has found its victory, the beast will not sleep forever. It has many heads with names like Lockheed, Bell, Monsanto, Dow, Grumman, Colt, and many more. They are all very, very hungry. So the beast must be fed, and each generation wages war to fulfill that hunger. And this time, it happened for the umpteenth time at the Valley Forge military base. It was time for them to feed the beast. Frank was shooting at the approaching NVA troops with his M60 when one of the soldiers came up to him and informed him that they were unable to inform Da Nang of the attack. The storm had damaged the signal so much that Frank and his troops were unable to call for any help from other American soldiers. but the soldier explained that they had received a call back from other armed forces east of them. Frank told the soldier to try. However, Colonel Ottman did not give them permission to use the radio, as if he had resigned himself to the situation and was just waiting for death to come. Without thinking, Frank ordered his soldiers to shoot Ottman. Suddenly, other soldiers shouted that their defenses had been penetrated by the enemy. Then Frank ordered his soldiers to take the cannon and shoot it at the NVA troops. This was immediately understood by Frank's soldiers by placing the cannon in the designated position and shooting at the NVA troops. At this point, Frank doesn't even hesitate. The chain of command, military law, and basic morality are all becoming secondary to what he believes needs to be done. After that, Frank and his two soldiers, who were none other than Angel and Stevie, entered the NVA troop area. While they were running, Angel's gun suddenly jammed, making Angel and Stevie, who faithfully accompanied him, panic. Angel beat the gun while babbling, and finally the gun caught fire. Stevie was shocked by calling the name of God, while Angel looked at Stevie while saying, "There ain't no God, fool. Look around you. There ain't no motherfucking God." You know, Angel's words hit differently once you know how this story ends. In a comic filled with death and suffering, it's hard to blame him for feeling abandoned by God. Stevie was shocked to see that his surroundings were surrounded by countless NVA troops. Meanwhile, Frank's other soldiers were still trying to fire at the NVA troops using the cannons that Frank had previously ordered. They continued to shoot until they destroyed several NVA soldiers. But soon after, they all ran scared, leaving the cannon because of the approaching NVA troops. Stevie himself hid in fear after seeing the horde of NVA troops. But suddenly, Coltrone came with his razor, strangling Stevie from behind. He asked Stevie, "Where's your nigger boy?" Stevie doesn't answer, and luckily, Captain Castle arrives in time to hit Coltrone with a shovel and save Stevie's life. "Let's go, Marine." By this time, the rain had stopped, and Stevie was now safely beside Captain Castle. He asked Frank about the state of the command post and the gunners. And Frank replied that the command post was overrun, as well as the gunners who were pierced by enemy bayonets. Stevie and Frank see NVA troops burning their friends, but are unable to do anything. Stevie asked his captain if they were the only two left, and Frank replied that he could still hear gunfire in other areas, so they rushed to the place where the gunfire could still be heard. I love this moment, because despite everything we've seen from Frank, he still refuses to abandon Stevie. In his own way, Frank genuinely cares about the men under his command. On the other hand, the NVA soldiers who had taken control of the command post came to destroy the place. There was also a dead Ottman who seemed to commit suicide by shooting a gun into his own head. They came to destroy the radio link between this military post and other military posts. In his heart, Stevie said, "I was so certain I would make it. The big freedom bird, 36 and a wake-up. I am out of here. In the end, I can do no more than follow on a killer's heels, rushing with him to his Alamo." This is the moment Stevie finally sees Frank for who he really is. Not simply a great soldier, but a man who seems almost destined to die in battle. Suddenly, an F-4 Phantom fighter jet flew over Stevie's head, dropping several bombs to destroy the NVA troops. Then, a huge explosion immediately occurred. Fortunately, the explosion was still far enough away from Frank. He could see the huge flames and see the fighter plane go away. Not just one. Apparently, the base sent several fighter jets to help their beleaguered Marines. The fighters bombarded the battlefield, killing hundreds or maybe even thousands of NVA soldiers. Seeing that help had arrived, Stevie smiled. But a moment later, Frank called him and ordered him to throw smoke bombs so that their position could be recognized by the fighter pilots. Stevie heard the order and was about to throw the smoke bomb, but he looked scared. He had already pulled the smoke bomb pin, but a burning NVA soldier ran up to him to stick a bayonet into his body. Then a hand pulled Stevie's collar back. At that moment, Stevie felt as if he was thrown into an airplane. He was greeted by several beautiful flight attendants who were ready to serve Stevie, one of whom gave him a bottle of beer. Stevie cried with happiness because he could finally go home. But it was just a dream. Stevie was dead. And honestly, this is probably the saddest moment in the entire story. Stevie represented hope, decency, and the possibility of a normal life after the war. With his death, those ideas seemed to die as well. Now Frank was left alone to face the relentless NVA troops armed with M60s. Frank's dark side tried to convince Frank to ask for his help. He promised that he would help Frank on the condition that Frank would allow it. He continued to convince Frank even though Frank could still fight alone against the NVA troops. Wound after wound rained down on his body, but Frank still did not want to submit. Frank even still fought them all using only the shovel that he had brought. He slaughtered them mercilessly until, one moment, Frank felt that he was completely surrounded by the inexhaustible NVA soldiers. Meanwhile, Frank's dark side was still offering his help, until one moment, Frank finally said, "Yes." This was the starting point where Frank's dark side began to take control of his body, which would later be known as the Punisher. One of the reasons Bourne is so memorable is that it suggests the Punisher wasn't created in Central Park years later. He was born right here in Vietnam. In the morning, many helicopters carrying soldiers were seen coming to Valley Forge to see the situation there. The soldiers began to inspect the place and saw thousands of bodies scattered there. They thought everyone was dead, but their steps suddenly stopped when they saw someone still standing there. One of the soldiers tried to approach the man who was standing still and check his condition, while the other soldiers were still shocked, as if they couldn't believe that there was still one American soldier who survived. It seemed that he alone finished off the entire NVA army. Frank slaughtered the entire NVA army with only an M16 that had run out of bullets, while his whole body was covered with wounds. They quickly took Frank away from there despite their astonishment at his condition, as well as their astonishment at what actually happened at Valley Forge, which seemed like hell for soldiers from both sides.
Frank finally left there, leaving behind all his slaughtered troops, including Stevie. They also sent Frank back to his homeland in an honorable state. Frank was greeted with joy by his wife and children. They looked so happy to welcome Frank back, even though he walked using a stick with a bandaged hand. Frank Jr. was also born, but did not really know his father. Frank's wife, Maria, tried to help Frank to walk, but Frank refused. She then asked Frank if he would return to the battlefield again. Frank replied that he would be very stupid if he went to the battlefield again, considering he already had a family that made him happy. But that happiness disappeared when Frank's dark side voice returned, making Frank so shocked and speechless. Frank's dark side emphasized to Frank that Valley Forge was just the beginning. He still had a long way to go. He also reminded Frank of the agreement Frank made with him. At that time, Frank agreed to his dark side's request so that Frank could slaughter the entire NVA army. But one thing Frank didn't know about the agreement: there was a price to be paid by Frank, and that price was his little family. Frank is still silent, unable to say anything, and can only listen to his dark side talking. Now it's too late for Frank to cancel the agreement. The dark side also said that Frank would get used to his presence, and also, Frank should enjoy his time with the family he loved. And honestly, the terrifying thing is that we already know this price will eventually be paid. That's what makes this scene feel less like a warning and more like a prophecy. The dark side instantly disappeared when Maria asked Frank who was daydreaming. Without thinking, Frank hugged his little family tightly, as if he would never leave them. "Hold on tight," Frank said to the little family, who became his life's hope. And every single time I reread this ending, this line hits hard. Frank doesn't know it yet, but he's holding on to the very thing
he's destined to lose. So in the end, Valley Forge fell. Almost everyone died. The war moved on, and Frank Castle went home. But honestly, that's not what stayed with me after reading Born. What stayed with me was the question this story leaves behind. Was the Punisher really created in Central Park? Or was he born right here in Vietnam? Because by the end of this story, it feels like Frank has already made his choice. The war didn't break him, the war revealed him. And that's what makes Punisher Max Born such a powerful story. It's not about the moment Frank Castle became the Punisher. It's about the moment he stopped fighting what he was becoming. And somehow, that makes the ending even more tragic. Because as readers, we know something Frank doesn't. The real war of his life is still waiting for him. And when it finally arrives, the Punisher will be ready.